Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Color Excellence for Digital Textile Printing. Today we have David Zwang. He will be leading a discussion on digital textile printing. I'm Amanda Carter, X-Rite's North American Marketing Manager, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Just a couple things before we get started. First off, for the webinar today, we will have everyone muted. So if you have a question, please use that questions function in the GoToWebinar panel. We'll have some time at the end to answer a few, and if we don't get to yours, we will have someone follow up. There will be a couple poll questions throughout the webinar, so keep an eye out for ways to participate. And finally, today's webinar will be recorded. You'll receive a link where you can review and share it at your convenience. I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. So digital textile is growing. Digital textile printing is growing, and it's growing at a fairly rapid pace. And the reason it's growing at a fairly rapid pace is basically some new printing technologies, and also a lot of new market demands, which is actually very exciting. So this webinar is really to focus on, now that we've got this digital textile printing going on, why should we care about color management, and what are the advantages to using color management, and what does that even mean, and why should it be important to you? I mean, after all, color management tools and processes aren't really new. They've been around since the 90s, basically, and they've really basically been the way to ensure that the designers, or the creators, if you will, and the production houses can actually work together and meet the expectations of the design as it was envisioned. So with this webinar also, we've got some wonderful panelists. So first of all, my name's Dave Zwang. I've been involved in color management and print production for probably 4 decades now. I've been at the forefront of color management since the beginning, and actually written many courses about color management and taught them all over the globe. But with me, which is even more important, is we've got two great panelists, Kristen Dettoni and Felix Wijaya. Kristen is an amazing, accomplished textile designer. She lives in southern New Hampshire. And Felix is co-founder of a company called Chroma Imaging, and they're a graphic design and production company. We're going to hear from them a little while, and I'm going to let them actually talk a little bit about what they do on a day-to-day basis, because I think that's important as we go through the discussion. So first of all, what is this all about? So, you know, when we think about color is really basically wavelengths, and the visible spectrum, everything that you can see, really falls between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers, and basically what that means is between ultraviolet and infrared. Everything in the middle is color and is visual. Anything below the ultraviolet is basically sound. Anything above it, the infrared, is heat. So we're working in this space, and the way that we normally look at color is we look at it and we talk about it as a gamut. This is everything that we theoretically should be able to see in the visible spectrum and or produce. And so, for example, and by the way, when I say produce, because gamuts are device dependent, which means that different devices actually have different gamuts. You know, just because you can see, you know, for the most part, all of us can see a very wide gamut. We get to certain kinds of monitors, and it's a more narrow gamut. We get to certain kinds of printing equipment, and it's even a narrower gamut. And then you start to throw in all sorts of other kinds of things, like the media you're printing on, etc., and the gamut can theoretically even shrink further. So first of all, it's a very important thing to start off with, because you have to understand that even devices, same model, I go into certain facilities and they may have 2 machines that in theory are identical, and we print and look at the gamut on them to see what they can actually print, and there's differences. So very important to understand that. So why do we need color management? When you capture something, whether you're capturing it on in a photograph or you are creating it digitally, that the way you're creating it, the way you're capturing it has, again, going back to that gamut we talked about, has a certain size gamut. We go to look at it on a monitor, which may have a different size gamut, and then print it on a printer, which has another size gamut. And you can see the differences on, and these are simulated, but you can see if you look at what in theory we're seeing in the camera versus what we're seeing in the monitor versus what we are reproducing on the printer, they're not the same. And I know that as a designer or a photographer, if I shot a picture, I would want the printer and to actually reproduce it the way I shot it, the way I saw it when I captured it. So normally, if you're not working in a good color managed workflow, we call it an uncontrolled workflow, everything that you're doing in every device, as I said before, because they each have their own characteristics, their own color gamut that they work with and how they reproduce certain colors can be different. So, you know, you look at again, the capture up in the upper left-hand side here from the camera, and then look at the two different printers. We have a display printer, and then we have a desktop printer, and you can see that the output from those are going to be different. This is not a good workflow, not if you're trying to maintain a certain level of expectation based on your design. Now, when we talk about color management, many people think, well, that has to do with calibration. And actually, to a degree, it does. However, all calibration does is really take a specific device, right? And each one of those that I showed before were different devices. And calibration basically takes that device and brings it to an established state, right? And in theory, that established state gives you the maximum available gamut for that specific device. But it's a device-specific operation. It's not a workflow or a process operation. So we can calibrate a printer, or we can calibrate a camera, or we can calibrate a scanner, or we can calibrate a monitor, and that's great for that specific thing if it's standing alone. But if we want to start using all of these devices to view the different types of, or the same, excuse me, to view the same image, we're going to have a problem. So what we really need to do is now find a way to be able to actually communicate the color in a very neutral way between these devices in their calibrated states, and that's done through something called characterization. And what characterization does is it basically identifies the device's color characteristics at a given state. Usually it's a calibrated state, you would hope, because otherwise you may not be getting the most out of that device. And when we talk about characterization, we're really looking at a number of different factors. We're looking at the inks or the colorants. Again, if they're CMYK, you would hope that what is that CMYK? I can tell you straight out that the CMYK inks on different printers are different. The cyan is not the same in one device as it is on another, or magenta or yellow or black for that matter. And the same thing with monitors. If they're LCD monitors or LED monitors, you're going to find that those colorants are going to vary. The substrate, the media, is going to have an effect. Are we printing on a bright white sheet? Are we printing on a sheet that's going to absorb color versus one that's going to let it stand out on the surface? The actual imaging technology, the marking, the dots, the dithers, the pixels, depending on what we're dealing with and what kind of a device we're dealing with, also have an effect, and it becomes part of the characterization. So all of this characterization information is usually, it can be achieved, it can be gathered, and it's gathered and communicated between devices through something called a profile. and many of you have heard of profiles. If you work with design applications, they say, oh, here, select the profile, select the color profile. That color profile is very specific to certain ink colorants, certain substrates, and certain marking or imaging techniques and qualities. So in order to be able to translate between all those device-dependent color spaces, RGB, CMYK, LAB, we assign a meaning, if you will, to those device-independent colors or the device-dependent colors, and those were those ICC profiles. So when we send, for example, in this diagram, when we take the picture, the ICC profile that's with that picture, the characterization goes into what's known as a lab connection space, which you think about it as it's kind of like a translation space, right? And then from that translation space, it actually goes to whatever the other connected device is, whether it's a monitor or maybe it's a printer or a number of different kinds of printers. If it's a scanner, the same thing, it goes into a connection space. And you can see when you do that, and you actually have those profiles working, going through these connection spaces, what you begin with, what you expect, actually can be reproduced in the other spaces, in these other devices. So that's really a controlled, color managed workflow. And it's not really that difficult to deal with, because the tools that you work with today, whether they're the design tools or they're the cameras or the printers, they're usually, and they have been pretty much since the 1990s, have been able to deal with profiles and understand what to do with it when that information comes to the individual device itself. Now, especially when we start to think about textiles, the substrate is a very important color. I mean, it's an important color whether you're working with textiles or papers or vinyls or other types of media. But if in fact you're working with substrates, you've got some other things you need to think about. And we're going to discuss some of that with the panelists, because these are things they deal with on a regular basis. Remember before I mentioned that sometimes you get absorption. So you've got the color of the media, you've got absorption of whatever that ink is into the textile, and that affects the way that the color is actually going to reproduce. There's one other thing that you need to very much think about and be aware of when you're dealing with color, and color management helps us get there. But viewing conditions change the color appearance. That's why in many cases you've seen these light boxes when people are looking at printed samples. The light boxes usually are tuned to basically 5,000 Kelvin, which is northern daylight. But if you take that if you're going to ultimately use it as a sign, you're printing a sign, and the sign is going to be used in a store where they have a lot of fluorescent lamps, well, that's going to change the way it's going to appear. So may look great in a viewing booth, but it may look a little bit on the green side in a store. Or on the other hand, if it's something that's going to be used for artwork, and you're going to put it on a wall somewhere in somebody's house, and they have a very warm 3,500 Kelvin kind of a light, it's going to change the way it looks too. It's going to look warmer. And on top of that, each of us also, interestingly enough, can see color different. And I'm not just talking about whether you're colorblind or not, but just because of the way you see it, because of the way the pigmentation is in your eyes, etc., and the way you process those signals, that also can affect the color. Maybe not as much unless you're severely colorblind, but it definitely affects it. So all of these things play into it. Now, so I've kind of given you a background. Now let's talk to the experts and see how they do it, and kind of how they deal with a lot of these issues in their day-to-day work. And the first expert we're going to talk to is Kristen Dettoni. And Kristen is a wonderful person. She's a designer, but I'm going to let her explain a little bit more about who she is and what she does. Kristen, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, well, thanks for having me, and I just want to make sure you can hear me, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So my name's Kristen Dettoni. I am the founder of Design Pool, and as David had said, I've been designing textiles for, I want to say, maybe about 30 years now. I kind of like to lose count after a while. Yeah, so essentially, I've been watching print on demand and print capabilities grow over the years, and I'm finding that there's more and more applications within commercial interiors, which is where I spent a lot of my design career with textiles. And so Design Pool is an online image library that you can take any of our designs, and we've partnered with printers such as Felix, who you'll meet in just a little bit, where essentially they can print any of our patterns on really any substrate, including textiles.
So Kristen, as a designer, what does color management mean to you? And interestingly enough, what does it mean to you today versus what it was 20 years ago and 10 years ago? Are you doing things differently?
That's a good question. I spent a lot of time in my early career working at textile mills, and so dealing with colorants, whether it was, dyeing a yarn or dyeing a fabric, or, and even in cases with printing. And I think that the thing that's changed over the years is that there's a lot more accessible tools for designers, and of course they've even grown a lot over the years for manufacturers to use. And the nice thing about them too is, even as a personal designer now and a self-employed business owner, there's a lot of nice inexpensive tools that you can tap into, as you mentioned earlier, for like screen calibration, things of that nature, which in the past you'd have to maybe, buy a really expensive light booth, which, an individual person probably couldn't afford that. But, for an easy $150, you can get a great little tool to calibrate your screen. I also think with, a great tool for designers is just to make sure you have a lot of references to pass on to the printer. So whether it's like Pantone books, or you're rating like Lowe's or Home Depot or Sherwin-Williams or something, to get some of those really great tools to translate what's in your head to what you actually want printed.
So those are kind of color aids, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that allow you to select the color. But I mean, how do you ensure that, or can you even ensure that a color that you give to somebody that you design with, and then you give it to a production house, how do you know that what you're giving them you're going to get back? And more importantly, do you always get back what you think you're going to get?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because I would say too, I mean, I hate to admit it, but when I got started, I mean, we weren't designing on computers, or if we were, it was very minimal. And you had, really expensive CAD software programs. Now with, Adobe and Photoshop and Illustrator, pretty much anyone can do that. So I think to that point, before you were kind of just looking at, like I was saying, like a paint chip, and then sort of visualizing in your head how it might look on, the fabric. Now you're looking almost at everything on a computer, or maybe if you're an interior designer, like I might be sending you a PDF to review. So I think, making that connection from the computer to something physical, I think that's where it can get a little challenging, as you were talking about earlier, because everything looks beautiful on a computer because it's backlit. You can get some like really beautiful saturated colors that sometimes just don't translate in a print, especially to your point too about substrates and things of that nature. So yeah, that's where I see one of the biggest challenges going from I'd say really going from computer, because I think everything's designed on a computer these days, to actually going to print. I mean, God, back in the day, it was like we were, painting on gouache, which that almost made a little more sense, because it was like, paper to paper, paper to fabric, versus digital, or, computer to fabric.
Do you find that there is significant difference when you're working with a lot of these different fabrics and the designs, even before, I guess, because even before you were working with a computer, yeah, you may have had swatch books that you were looking at, or swatches that you were looking at, but each of those swatches would be a little bit different on the different fabrics, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so to your point too with the substrates, it depends on the substrate that you are starting with, and then even texture, because obviously every fabric has different texture, and I think to your point, it's going to absorb the ink differently. It depends on the fiber that you're working with, because you can print on cottons and polyesters and blends. That's all going to take ink very differently. And then also too, not so much with residential, but especially in commercial, you could be doing a lot more finishes to the fabric after the fact. So even after it's printed, which can also shift the colors of the ink. So if you're having to do some kind of like flame retardant coating, or something to maybe improve the abrasion, it could be a number of different things. But that's gonna affect it as well. So it's funny because I would say we try so much to from a sampling standpoint, like kind of cut costs so that people maybe can approve something on paper. But it's always been my experience, at least working with textiles, to always have at least my end customer approve something get an actual sample and approve it on the physical sample. Because even if someone tells me, oh no, it's fine, I can just look at paper, print out, it'll be fine. And I'm like, no. Like you're gonna be surprised. It's not gonna go from like red to blue, but I mean, that red could shift to an orange, the red could shift to a yellow. So even though it's in the same red family, you are gonna get color shift. And I just think it's really important too that people actually get a physical sample of what they're gonna get in production, and that's what they approve.
So you're actually creating a color proof on the, or you're giving it to someone to create a color proof on the specific fabric that you're dealing with. It would seem to me as though that could be a very time consuming and expensive proposition. Is something you do a lot, or do you get involved in using things like color management to try to work through some of that, mitigate some of that?
Right. I mean, we definitely do get involved in as much color management as possible. And I think it's really important, especially for me, because sometimes I'm the go-between, with the interior designer and trying to understand their vision of color. And then, I'm taking that into the computer, and then I'm, bringing that computer file over to the printer. And so, and that's where I think, to your point, like the color management tools are so important. So for me, it's really important in working with the interior designer to get some kind of tangible color reference that to me, and I prefer something like a Pantone or Sherwin-Williams paint chip, or whatever, Behr, whatever kind of, any company, paint chip company, something that I can easily scan into the computer, or something that Illustrator already has, like color book forms where I can just load the paint chips or color chips into my Illustrator program. So, but that's just one part of the problem. Then the next part is for me to communicate that color from me to the printer, in which case then that's where I'm then talking to the printer and saying, to your point earlier about the ICC color profiles and things like that, how do you want this file? Do you want an Illustrator file? Do you need a high-res JPEG? Do you prefer a PDF? Like, if I'm giving you a Photoshop file, like what do you want that to look like? Because for me, I kind of like to make everyone's job a little easier. So the more information a printer can give me about how they want their files set up, I'm always happy to accommodate, to your point, to speed the process up and make it easier for everyone else. I don't think I've ever I should say once in my career, I did allow an interior designer to approve something on paper and it didn't turn out good. So, their job is to make things look beautiful, pick the right choice, pick the right colors, pick the right materials. Not everyone can be an expert in all things. And so that's where, as much as I can help them and communicate to them, and then also communicate with the printer so that the interior designer can get exactly what they want. And to your point, trying to make it as seamless and as inexpensive as possible to go from point A to point B, and then, for everyone to be happy in the end.
Are you finding that in today's environment where everybody seems to have computers and they're looking at things, I'm sure the interior designers are using computers, are you finding that the setting levels of expectation from the interior designer to you, and then you to the production house, are more difficult today than they used to be? Are people more forgiving or less forgiving?
I think people are a little, I would say a little less forgiving, but I also tend to educate up front. So again, like, when someone's coming to me and they want something, I try and give them as much information up front so that so that there's I don't want to say like, you know, they're not disappointed, because I don't think you're ever going to be disappointed, but I think you can't be, it's not a perfectionist from the standpoint of, you know, again, if they're giving me a red color swatch, we're probably going to come very, 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 very close to that swatch. Is it going to be an exact dead-on match? To your point earlier about the, you know, how you're viewing the color, probably not, because, you know, if they have fluorescent lights, then it's going to be different than daylight. So those are the things where I think in a webinar like this actually is really great, because the more you can educate someone on how to view color, how to communicate color, to me, that's just going to help everything in the end. And so I see it as getting better because people have more of that education at their fingertips.
Sure, sure. Okay, that's great. How many different textile production companies do you work with?
From a textile standpoint, I would say probably over the years, at least like half a dozen. I mean, I think a lot of, I feel like a lot of printers that are out there, like again, we'll talk to Felix in a little bit, they can do so many multiple things and print on multiple substrates, and textiles being one of them. I mean, the technology today is super cool. Again, I think the challenge is for me when I'm dealing with the printers is to understand what their needs are and what they need from me. Again, because I'm just there to try and make their life as easy as possible, because, you know, it just helps us all out in the end, because then I can get my sample faster and my customer will be happy, and, you know, less time, less money, and everyone's happy. So
very good. Well, we're gonna stop now and we're gonna take a poll. So, and by the way, don't forget, if you have any questions out there, please put them in the question dialog box and we'll answer them at the end. And if we don't have time, we'll answer them after the fact. So we're gonna launch the poll now, 15 seconds. How familiar are you with color management using measurement devices? Okay, we're going to close the poll. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open it up to someone on the other end of the spectrum, and that's Felix Wijaya. And Felix, do me a favor, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about Chroma Imaging and what you guys do.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming today. I assume everybody can hear me okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So my name is Felix Wijaya. I'm the co-founder of Chroma Imaging. We are a full-service design and production company. We have designers and production in-house, including fabricating. We typically work with multiple design companies, such as ad agencies, interior designers, architects, and also trade show and exhibit event companies. And that's basically what we do.
So you basically, from what you said, you've got a lot of different types of products that you actually produce and work with. What kinds of different media and substrates do you print on?
Oh wow, we print on multiple different substrates, especially when you do an event. We actually print on different substrates, from rigid to soft signage to fabric to sometimes on acrylic type of material. So really a whole spectrum of substrates in our production shops.
And when you're working with textiles, is most of it for signage? Do you do other type? Do you do production or pre-production for other types of textile work, or is it all signage?
Mostly soft signage for us, but then we also do interior textiles as well for our interior design and architect clients. And also we print on canvas as well, which actually which is a different process than the actual textile printing on die sublimation.
And what, maybe you can even tell the attendees what kind of differences do you have to deal with then as a result of all these different types of substrates?
So printing on textile is it's really it's challenging but fun at the same time, because you have so many different aspects that you deal with when you print on textiles. Number one, you have different white points. So, you really have to profile your substrates, on the different white points. Number two, textures. So you have to use the right measurement devices, the correct one, to actually measure the color on these textured material. If you don't use the right type of material, you want to print a red color, it might actually turn out orange or even blue, if your measurement device is not correct. So these whole different aspects. And also, what a lot of people don't think about is when you print on textile, you actually have to deal with stretch and shrinkage issues as well. So those are the type of things that us as a production house, we take a look at all of the aspects from the very beginning, because not only color, but all of the other aspects can affect the color that we're printing.
So the dimensional stability of it, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
So you say you do shows and different types of things. So when you're producing a campaign, that campaign could actually have different types of products or sub products, if you will, on different types of media. How do you get them all to match?
So, we deal with that on a daily basis, where when you do a campaign or an event, not only you're printing on different substrates, but also two substrates can actually be next to each other. There's so many occasions where we would print on a recycled material or on a PVC, and then right next to it we have textile. And these, we print them on different printers, and different printers have different saturation and gamut as well. So that's where it's very important for us to do our color profiles on different substrates. And everything is going to be within tolerance, and that's what I try to explain to people all the time. Yes, you want it to match, but there's a certain tolerance that you need to be able to accept in between substrates. We try our best to color match between different substrates to be very, very close. And those tolerances are what I always try to educate people on, because when you have typically designer are a little bit more picky on that, because what they see on their monitor, it doesn't matter if they're on different substrates or not, they're going to be the same color. But then the different substrates and different angles also, and different lighting could really change the way you take a look at those substrates once they're printed and installed.
So I think this is a very important point, and I want to just kind of go back, circle around on this one more time. So when you're looking at you have a lot of how many different kinds of printers you have in your plant?
Oh, we have so many different ones. We have dye sublimation, and we have a UV direct printer, and also we have latex printers.
And you have another plant too, don't you? You have two plants.
We do. We have two locations, one in Virginia and one in Florida. And
okay,
go ahead.
No, so you've got multiple printers, multiple printer types in multiple locations,
yes.
printing on a plethora of different kinds of materials. Do you create profiles for each of those printers and each of those substrates, and so that you have one for each of the as the occasion presents itself?
We do. So we have a profile for everything and for every location as well. And as the owner of the company, I try to keep everything consistent. So we create redundancy. So every printer that we have so for both locations, we actually have the same type of printers. But then, as you mentioned earlier, even though they are exactly the same type, same model printers, they don't produce the same color. This is why color management and color profiles are so important, because we would have two printers side by side, and if we were to print two different the same type of file, they might actually look different. But then, if it's if you just kind of separate it a little bit, you won't know the difference. That's how we do our color profile. And for the multiple different substrates, we also have multiple different colors on our printers. Some of our printers have 4 color, and then some of our printers have 6 color. So, the one with the 6 color, of course, will produce a much better color gamut on different substrates. And then the pixels as well on some of these printers. You have to deal with those type of things where I'm sure some of the attendees might have the different printers as well, but the pixels on that's probably the easiest way to explain it. Different print heads can print different size pixels on different material. So you have to actually take a look at that when you do your color profile and color management, especially when you have 2 different locations. So we typically start from one location first, do all of the color profiles for all the different substrates, and they all will match within a tolerance. And from there, we actually bring that to the second location. They have something to go off of, and then they would match the same color profile. It's a whole fun process.
Oh yeah, and do you find that there is variability? In other words, you may get another batch, a bolt of fabric, or another batch of PVC or whatever, and they actually change.
All the time. So as a printer, we typically buy material in bulk from the same lot number, and we typically don't print the same job on different lot numbers, because that white point could actually make a huge difference from one lot number to another, even though it's the same manufacturer. So those type of challenges bring us to some of the processes that we have within our company, where every so often we actually do a linearization on all of our printers, because even though you do your color profile, the more you use your printers, some of those color might actually change. And also, what a lot of people don't think about is the weather and the temperature. So we have 2 different type of weather in both our location, one in Florida, which is humid and warm, and then in Virginia, DC area, which is very dry. So we actually have to do our color profiles a little bit differently for both locations. Those are the type of things that are very, very challenging, like in the past, but now with the proper tools that we use, it's a lot easier now.
When you're working with textiles specifically, what kinds of additional challenges? I know Kristen mentioned before, some of the absorption and the perhaps the if you will, the tightness of the weave, things like that. Do they really throw things off that significant?
Absolutely. And also, if we're talking about more dust sublimation process, you don't print, when you actually print, it doesn't produce the color right away. You actually have to sublimate it to actually get the right color. So when you're printing dye sublimation, as the printer printing it on the printer, the color would be so off until it gets sublimated, and that's one of the challenges. And when you have the different weaves, that fabric could absorb that ink a little bit differently as well. So, and sometimes if you look at it from different angles, you can see the color might actually look darker from certain angles, or it might actually look lighter from certain angles.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're actually, with sublimation, for those people out there who don't really fully understand that process, you're actually baking those pigments into that fabric. And when you heat up anything, it's going to change the color.
Yes, exactly. And that's where, all of our printers are actually in a temperature control environment, because if you don't control that environment, from one print to another, if your temperature fluctuates, not only the type of fabric that you're printing on, the temperature might actually change the color as well.
Right. Wow.
I think too, if I can interject one thing, we were talking about samples, and you had mentioned about it is, kind of expensive and lengthy for a sample, but I think what's so great about that sample, as just hearing everything all the challenges that Felix has with, color change and things like that. So once that sample is approved by the customer, then that can become the standard for production. So if you had to run that, additional yardage a year from now or 6 months from now, you can go back to that sample as your production standard, and you have something to match to. At least that's how I, that's why it's so important for me. And then to Felix's point too about it can even just shift, like the color can shift as you're walking around the fabric, or even how you're, how you lay the fabric. Is the fabric going to be upholstered? Is it going to be on the wall? So, I mean, I think giving that physical sample, though it is time consuming and though it is an added expense, but having that in the hands of that interior designer or your end customer, so they can touch it, they can feel it, they can put it in the space that it's going to be in and the lighting that it's going to be in. I think that's what's so important. There has been a lot of talk, and there are a lot of great tools out there to try and eliminate that sample, but with textiles, it's such a tactile thing that sometimes people just want to feel it for the touch. So,
yeah. Hey, Felix. So here you're working with Kristen, and you've worked with her for a while, and she's obviously a very experienced textile designer. What happens now when you get a new textile designer in that you've never worked with before? How do you what's the process? How do you educate them? How do you bring them into it so that they can begin to get that same, well, maybe not the complete level of understanding, because that's only that Kristen has, because that's only going to come with time, but at least one that's workable?
We always ask designers, spec Pantone color. When you spec a Pantone color, we can hit that color much better than a custom built color, because when we do our color profiles, we always profile to certain Pantone colors that are hard to hit. And I'm pretty sure some of the printers know what some of those color are. But once you profile your printers and you can actually hit some of those hard to hit color, you're pretty much golden. But then when we have such a great technology right now, even though you have a custom built color like Kristen mentioned earlier. So if we have a paint chip, we can actually scan that paint chip now onto the computer, and then we can tell our rip server to print that certain color.
So it's actually taking into account the profile, whatever the profile is for that device, right, against what you're bringing in, which makes perfect sense. Again, one of the benefits of really working with this technology, with good color management technology. Absolutely. What I'm going to do is I want to open it up for some additional questions. We've got one or two in here now, and I'm going to throw up a poll and give people. So that we're going to do another poll. While we're doing the poll, I'd also like the audience to please bring out some more questions and throw them into the question dialog box. So how often do you have to rework your project based on unacceptable color? That's great. And we're going to close the poll again, give you a couple more seconds. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience, and we've got, or the attendees, and we've got a bunch of questions here. And I'm going to start with the first one. I'm going to try and read it. And this is for Kristen, and it's from Mary Schilling. How often are your customers requesting printer simulation profiles based on specific printer materials to use within Adobe, as well as profile targets?
Printers, I'm not sure if I understand that. Printed simulation,
So,
like a simulated woven fabric?
yeah, I'm gonna, you know what? I don't know if I can actually do that. I was gonna say I'd let her actually ask you, but I think what she's asking is if you would your customers want a profile? Would you give them a profile so that they can view what, in essence, you've gotten? So if Felix gave you a profile, because that's basically what they're going to do, and you're giving it now, you're working with a customer, right? You know, a designer. Would you give that designer the profile so that she or he could actually also take advantage of?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I'm working with an interior designer and they have computer skills and they're trying to you know, communicate to me and yeah, they're wondering what profile that particular printer is working with, I'm happy to share as much information as possible. Again, just to make it easier on everyone, and so also there's less surprises. I think where I run into problems today is that I would say most people don't even calibrate their screens. And that's okay. I don't think you need to have your screen calibrated. You know, I think that you know, it's again, I think that's where it comes back to the sample. So, you know, I think for the most part, most designers know they can't trust what's on their screen. I mean, even when you're shopping online, you can't necessarily trust what's on your screen. So, but yeah, as much information people want, I think is great. I'm happy to provide it.
Okay, well, that's great. And I think this one's probably for, actually it could be for either of you, from Hi Radu Enescu, and they ask, how do you scan the paint chip?
So I do it a little funky. So I don't use my scanner. I actually use a color photo card that you would do to, if you were doing like high-end photography and you wanted to calibrate the photo within Photoshop. So it's just a basic, you know, black and white with, you know, a rainbow of colors. You stick the card down. I stick the card down next to the paint chip. I take a photo, I mean, embarrassed to say, on my iPhone, and then I bring that into Photoshop and I color correct it in Photoshop using the white balance so that I get the exact color that I need, and then I take that into Illustrator. And in fact, I was talking to a color expert, and he's like, actually, that's the best way to do it. So unbeknownst to me, I found a great workaround that fits well.
So let me, you know, here we are, and this is a webinar that's being sponsored by X-Rite. Wouldn't you wouldn't you use a spectrophotometer to actually measure that paint chip? And probably I'd like to get it from both of you. Is it something, Kristen, that you would do? And Felix, isn't that something you would do?
So for me,
That's actually, go ahead, Kristen.
I was gonna say really quickly, I think spectrophotometers are kind of expensive if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know if I could afford that. So that's how I do my little workaround, but I'll let Felix answer.
So we actually have two of them. We have two I1s and our, just, you know, for each location. So the one I1 is only specific to rigid substrates that have smooth surfaces. And then we have the new toy that I call it, the I1 Pro 3 Plus. So that actually can scan the fabric with a bigger aperture on. The bigger aperture actually can scan the more textured material. And the way we do it is we would actually scan the color, and then we would do a test print and make sure that actually prints the right color. On our process, it's a little bit different because we wanted to make sure that it will hit that same color. And the other way we can do it is the same thing as as Kristen is doing. What we typically do, we get a paint chip, we take a look at a Pantone book, and then we find the closest color. If we can find the closest color, that's what we're gonna hit.
Okay.
But
And
if
I think
you do have, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and I think for me, like if I'm communicating with Felix, since I don't have a spectrophotometer, and someone wanted to match to something that was outside of the scope of Illustrator, so it wasn't in a Pantone book, and maybe it was, you know, a random swatch they sent me. What I'll do is I'll get that physical swatch, I'll do my little trick on my end, I'll color correct it within or design it within Illustrator, and then when I send that file to Felix, what I would do is say, Felix, here's the color swatch I'm matching to, because the other thing too that can happen between me and the printers when I'm sending my digital file, they can shift the file, the whole file, you know, a little red or a little green or a little on their end. So they can't change individual colors within the file. That's something that has to be done in the computer. But if they're trying to match something overall to say like a gray paint chip, and I've done my best on my end, when I send them that file, I'm saying, hey, I'm matching to, you know, gray number 5 or whatever it is, then they can even shift that as they're printing as well on their end.
I have another great question, and Felix, I think this is probably more towards to you, but it could be one for Kristen as well. And it's from Niall Cody, and basically he's asking, do you work toward any instead of trying to kind of, do you work towards any print standards like Grackle or one of the ISO
We
standards?
do. Yeah, so we actually profile all of our printers based on the G7. So we're G7 compliant on all of our printers in both locations. That's typically what we feel is the best, and that's, you know, that's within the tolerance that everybody accepts as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, let's see. We got some more questions, and we're beginning to get. Let's see. This one. Here's a question. Another one from Mary Schilling for Felix. Do you calibrate each of your printers based on one printer's target? In other words, piggybacking printers or targeting an ISO X Gamut color space.
So I'm hoping I get the question right. So if we were to have, you know, like the textile printer, we actually do the color profile based on each material. So we don't actually copy a a profile from a different material to the next material, because with textile it's a little bit more challenging because it's not a smooth surface. So you don't actually want to do that. So we actually create all of our textile profile from scratch.
Okay. By the way, Dan Reed, and I appreciate this. Thank you, Dan. Dan Reed just mentioned that maybe somebody should mention the Pantone Capture device, and that's for those of you who are not aware. And Kristen, this is good for you too. While the trick you're doing with the phone is very cool, the Pantone Capture device is a relatively inexpensive colorimeter that can be used to capture that color and then communicate it. So it's something that you might want to.
Well, yeah, I will definitely look into that. I think the challenging thing as a designer and or if you are kind of the sole proprietor of your own business or consulting is to stay on top of all the amazing tools that are out there. So it's nice to know, because again, like I said, I mean, you know, probably 5-10 years ago, you couldn't easily calibrate your computer without probably spending $1,000. Now you can find a great, you know, calibration for $150, $200. So
Right.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess when you're working with fabric, this is another one from Mary, and this is probably for you, Felix. Do you use, what kind of aperture are you using for your spectrum when you're doing fabric? Do you know what size aperture you're using?
You know what? I don't know on the top of my head, but
What kind of device are you using?
so we're actually using i1 Pro 3 Plus, which is actually very good for textile.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
we've been using it for quite some time now, and we've been very happy. It's been hitting the color really well.
Yep. Yep. Very good. All right. Well, we're beginning to run out of time here, so I want to do another poll, and I'm going to do this poll here, and you've got some time. So based on today's webinar, do you feel that color management tools can enhance your workflow? And I'll give you some time to answer that.